When I first started teaching, I thought my job was to help students not make mistakes. I paid careful attention to what my students said, what they did, and how they responded, so that whenever they made a mistake, I was there to catch it, correct it, and send them on their way. I was an expert mistake fixer. I monitored student behavior, carefully putting dots when they failed to hand in their homework, putting dots when they were late, putting dots when they did not participate, putting 4 dots when they were absent. I held those dots on my students' head like the sword of Damocles. I was the dot master. I noticed that my students made predictable mistakes, and I modified my lessons to address those mistakes. Don't forget to change the sign of the second number when you multiply across a negative sign. X times s is x squared, not 2x. Don't cancel the x's. However, I still frequently found myself confused by what they were doing. Didn't make any sense to me. I became curious about where student mistakes come from. Why is this student writing a +1 there? What does this mean to him? Why are these students doing these crazy things? Over the years as I taught, I began to realize that what students said and what they did was a result of something they were doing that I could not directly observe. I began to form a hypothesis. Students think. In fact, I began to realize that students think quite a lot. I began to think that my job was to intervene in how they were thinking, rather than intervene on the result of that thinking. I realized that if what students do is a result of their thinking, then I need to know what they were thinking, not just what they write. I needed to be able to read minds. Unfortunately, I still thought my job was to fix their thinking as if it were something that had been broken by their experiences. I thought that my students were just thinking wrong things, and therefore all I had to do was correct their thinking. A teacher is a mechanic for the mind, I thought to myself, and I just need to know how it works in order to repair it. I wanted to be able to reach into my students' minds and fix them. I viewed my students as broken, and my job was to make them whole again. I listened to what my students said and thought about what it meant they were thinking. I carefully watched what students did and how they responded to help me prognosticate their actions. If I just know enough about how they think, I thought, I can help them think better. I was judge, I was jury, and I executed based on my understanding of student thinking. I tried students for the crime of thinking differently than I thought and sentenced them to more explanations of the only truth that mattered. My truth. This approach has some flaws. It has limitations. 10 distinct opportunities to think mathematically for each kid. 20 kids a class, 6 classes a day, 5 days in a week, 34 school weeks in a year. That's 204,000 thoughts a year to pay attention to. It was overwhelming. And you know what? One day I realized that the kids I had yesterday weren't thinking exactly the same today. Any analysis I attempted to do with student thinking was out of date by the class in which I wanted to use it, because just like me, kids don't think the same way about mathematics every day. Imagine you're driving a car while blindfolded. Do you think you could make it home from your daily commute unscathed? You'd hit 1,000 obstacles on the way home. Yet this is exactly what a classroom where thinking is hidden looks like. Kids encounter 1,000 obstacles or thinking have no one to support them. I began to anticipate student thinking instead of anticipating student mistakes. Here's 11 different ways I solved a problem. Each way represents a way of thinking. Guess how many of these ways were actually used by my students? None of them. Human cognition is incredibly complex. As I moved forward toward thinking about student thinking, I began to question some of my beliefs about mathematics and why we teach it. Are these symbols in mathematics, or is it something else? What do I want my students to get out of mathematics class? More importantly, what do my students want to get out of mathematics class? We are conditioned to think of ideas, particularly mathematical ideas, as being right or wrong, correct or incorrect, true or false. Here's a kid who's clearly constructing her own understanding of the mathematics. How does what she has done make sense to her? Let's remember that when students make mistakes, it's a result of thinking. There are other benefits to making student thinking visible in a classroom. An ongoing mathematically rich conversation engages all of my students in thinking about mathematics in ways which give them agency, authority, and work within their identity. How do we design mathematics classrooms which students don't end up thinking they've spent 13 years memorizing arcane rituals with no purpose? I argue that the best way to start is by paying attention to student thinking instead of student mistakes. Let's make mathematics class about learning about thinking rather than about trying to avoid making errors. Children are not broken adults. It's not our job to treat them as objects to fix. They are sense makers and already fully formed people. Our job as educators is to provide experienced as teachers so that when they can develop models for understanding the world. I want my kids to know that everyone, including their teachers, is actively trying to understand how each other is thinking rather than assigning thinking on some arbitrary scale of right versus wrong. I want my own kids to grow up in a world where we respect each other's minds and how they operate, each in their own way.